Imagine this, it's the middle of the night. The kind of night where everything seems quiet. No cars passing, no distant voices, just the stillness that makes your house feel oddly empty. And then from downstairs you hear it. A sound. Just a small creak at first, barely enough to catch your attention. But it's there. You know it. Something has shifted in the silence. It's 2 a.m. Your mind races, but you tell yourself it's nothing. Probably just the house settling or maybe the wind. You tell yourself it's nothing. But as you lie there waiting, listening, the sound comes again. This time it's louder. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, creeping closer to where you lie. You're alone. There's no reason anyone should be in your house. But still the footsteps come. Step by step they get closer. Your pulse quickens, your breath sharpens. You strain your ears trying to make sense of the sound. You want to believe it's just your imagination. But it's real and it's coming for you. How would you react if you were trapped in that moment? Alone in the dark with no explanation for what's happening around you? The sound that was nothing, now becoming everything. Would you stay frozen, heart pounding in your chest, too scared to move? Or would you get up, try to confront what's waiting for you in the dark? And what if you couldn't explain it? What if, after all your attempts to make sense of it, there was no logical explanation? What if the terror you're facing was something that could never be explained away? Tonight, we'll walk through the story of someone who found themselves in the midst of just such a nightmare. A story where reality bends, and fear becomes something far more than just a feeling. A person who faced a terror they couldn't outrun, and barely survived to tell their tale. Keep listening. Because as we dive deeper into this true horror story, you'll begin to question what you know about fear, about what you think is real. The kind of fear that starts quietly but soon grows, leaving you questioning every shadow, every creak in the floorboards. Is it just a sound? Or is it something more? Something hidden in the shadows, just beyond your reach, waiting for you to realize it's been there all along. Hold tight. We're just getting started. Meet Sarah, a young college student, navigating the usual whirlwind of life in a small, quiet town. She wasn't anything out of the ordinary, practical, grounded, and not someone who spent her time entertaining the idea of things that didn't make sense. Ghosts, spirits, the supernatural. To Sarah, those were just stories people told around campfires in the dark when they had too much time to think. She had a logical mind, a mind that thrived on reason, science, and practicality. Sarah didn't waste her energy on things that didn't have evidence. Life was about hard work, studying, making plans for the future. The kind of future that didn't involve anything outside of her control. At least, that's what she believed before she moved into that house. Sarah had just moved into a modest house near the college. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a small, aging structure that had seen its fair share of years. But to Sarah it was perfect. It was exactly what she needed. A place to herself, away from the noise of campus life. A quiet spot to study, to rest, to think. A place where the world outside didn't feel so overwhelming. The house was old, yes, with creaky floors and drafty windows that rattled in the wind, but that was part of its charm. The scent of old wood and the faint dusting of age added a character to the house that felt familiar, cozy. For Sarah, it was the kind of environment she could call home. Not too big, not too small. Just enough to give her the peace and solitude she wanted. It was exactly the kind of place she could curl up with a cup of tea and a book after a long day of lectures. It had all the comforts she needed, and she settled in easily. Sarah wasn't someone who believed in signs, but this house felt right. It fit her routine perfectly. She started to feel a sense of belonging there. But even the most peaceful of places can hold secrets. At first, the house seemed to be just as calm as Sarah had hoped. Her days went by in the usual rhythm of college life. Morning classes, late-night study sessions, and weekends with friends. The kind of life where nothing really stands out, where everything feels like it's just going as it should. But then came the little things. The things that didn't make sense but were so small, so easy to dismiss. A faint sound in the middle of the night, a creak in the hallway, a tap on the wall. It was nothing, Sarah told herself. Nothing but the house settling, the wind, or the occasional crack of a branch against the window. Small noises that could easily be explained away. She would shrug it off, chalk it up to the house's age. Old houses make noises. She knew that. Everyone knew that. But as the days passed, those noises became harder to ignore. The scratching sound that seemed to come from behind the walls. The faint whisper of footsteps that echoed through the empty rooms. Each time she convinced herself it was just her mind playing tricks. Just the house, just the wind. But even she couldn't ignore the way the air around her seemed to thicken, how the silence began to feel a little heavier. It wasn't until the fourth or fifth night, when Sarah was lying in bed, that she heard something that stopped her cold. At first, it was the faintest sound, a soft scuffle of feet on the hardwood floor. She blinked, straining to hear it again. The house was quiet. She was sure of it. But then the sound came again, slower this time, almost deliberate. Her heart began to race. It was unmistakable. The slow, methodical sound of someone walking through the hallway. She listened, not sure if she should get up, not sure if she wanted to know what was causing the noise. The steps grew louder, closer. Sarah's chest tightened, but she stayed still, trying to convince herself it was nothing. Her mind was just playing tricks. Every instinct told her to stay still. But as she listened, her mind raced with questions. Who could be here? I'm alone. She waited in the dark, trying to hold her breath, listening for any sign of what was coming. The steps stopped just outside her bedroom door, just out of sight. And then they began to retreat. By the time Sarah had convinced herself it was just a figment of her imagination, she had almost forgotten about it. She chalked it up to the house's age. Maybe the floorboards were just creaking on their own. Maybe the wind had pushed something against the door. But when it happened again, she couldn't ignore it. This time she was sitting in the living room reading a book. The evening was calm, no wind, no sound. Just the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. But then she heard it. A knock. Soft, deliberate at the door. She frowned, confused. No one had called, no friends were coming over. No deliveries were expected. And yet there it was. A knock just outside her door, so calm, so ordinary, that it could have easily been brushed off. But something about it didn't feel right. Sarah stood up, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. The porch light cast shadows on the empty steps. No car. No footsteps leading away. Just the eerie quiet of the night. She opened the door, just a crack, looking left and right, but still, no one. Confused, she stepped outside for a moment, peering into the darkness. The street was empty, the houses around her still. Nothing out of the ordinary. She glanced down at the door frame. No marks, no footprints. Just the same old house, standing silent as always. She shut the door, locked it, and walked back into the living room, trying to dismiss the feeling creeping over her. She told herself it was nothing. Just a prank. Maybe a neighbor messing with her. But as she sat back down, the feeling of unease didn't leave her. It lingered, heavy in the air, like something had changed. Something was there that shouldn't have been. At first, Sarah thought it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. After all, it had to be. The wind, the house settling, it was always the same excuses she told herself. But this time the sound was different. The sound wasn't just a creak or a rattle. It was distinct. A clear, deliberate step. The kind of step you could feel in the pit of your stomach. Each footfall echoing in the silence of the night. Slow, deliberate, they kept coming. Each footstep seemed to linger longer, as if whoever, whatever it was aware of her presence. The floorboards creaked under the weight of the footsteps, a sound that grew louder and more distinct with every passing second. Step, step, step. Coming closer. And closer. Terrified, Sarah lay completely still. Her eyes wide open in the dark, her heart hammering in her chest. She told herself to move, to get up, to check the door, but she couldn't. It was as if her body refused to respond. She was frozen, and all she could do was listen to the sound growing nearer. The footsteps, now just outside her bedroom door. Her breath hitched in her throat. The house had been silent all night. She was sure of it. So where did these footsteps come from? Who was in the house? Each step felt like it was pushing the boundaries of her sanity. The idea of someone, being so close, yet out of sight, gripped her with an anxiety that tore through her veins. She wanted to call out, to demand who it was, but her voice wouldn't come. It was as if the air around her had thickened, pressing down on her chest, choking her. The silence that followed the last step was almost worse than the sound itself. It was heavy, like a weight was pressing down on her, the stillness growing unbearable. She wanted to move, to check, to do something, anything. But fear, that primal, instinctive fear, had her locked in place. What could she possibly do if she opened that door? Was she even safe in her own home anymore? The knocking, though soft, felt far too deliberate. It wasn't random like the wind might cause. It was intentional. Someone, or something, was trying to get in, to make contact, to force her to acknowledge its presence. Her mind raced, the panic setting in, every possible explanation running through her head. But none of them made sense. Who could be in her house? How could someone have gotten in without her hearing? She was sure the doors had been locked, the windows closed tight. And yet, the tapping continued. She pulled the blanket up over her head, as if hiding from the darkness might shield her from whatever was lurking just outside the door. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't. The sound of her heart was too loud in her ears. She wanted to run, but she didn't dare move a muscle. And then, just when she thought it might end, the sound stopped. But the house didn't feel any quieter. It didn't feel any safer. She could feel the presence still there, watching her, lurking in the dark corners of the room. And just like that, the fear, thick and suffocating, returned. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The darkness in the room felt alive. Her eyes darted around the room. Nothing. No movement. No shadow. Just the stillness of her own thoughts closing in. She knew the next step could be the one that changes everything, but she couldn't make herself move. And the presence, the feeling that something was there, was it ever really gone? Over the next few nights, Sarah's sense of safety, her sense of normalcy, began to erode. What had started as strange noises, those subtle hints that something wasn't quite right, now felt like something far more menacing was at play. The air itself seemed to thicken, to weigh heavier with each passing evening. At first, she brushed it off as stress, a byproduct of late-night studying and the usual college fatigue. After all, it wasn't uncommon for an old house to creak, for a book to fall off a shelf, or for the lights to flicker on occasion. But as the days wore on, the incidents became harder to ignore, harder to dismiss as coincidence. One evening, as Sarah settled into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea and a textbook, she heard it again. A soft thud, almost imperceptible, coming from the far side of the room. At first, she thought it was just the usual creak of the old wood floors. But then she saw it. A book, one of the many that lined her shelves, had fallen to the ground. The pages flopped open, the book resting on the floor as if someone had thrown it there. Sarah frowned, confused. She was alone. No one had been in the room with her. No one had touched the shelf. Yet the book was there in the center of the room. She didn't remember knocking it off. She picked it up, dusted it off, and placed it back, but the feeling of discomfort lingered. She couldn't shake the sensation that something had just been in the room with her. The lights, too, had started to misbehave. At first, it was just a flicker here or there, easy enough to dismiss. But over the course of a week, the flickers grew more frequent. The light bulbs would buzz, their glow dimming and then brightening again without explanation. Sometimes the lights would flicker out entirely, only to come back on moments later, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls. It was as if the house itself was playing tricks on her, mocking her attempts to understand what was happening. One night, as she sat reading in bed, the temperature in the room dropped. She hadn't noticed it at first, but soon she could feel the cold seeping into her skin, biting into her bones. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from a draft. It wasn't natural. It felt wrong, like something that didn't belong. She wrapped herself tighter in the blanket, but the cold seemed to follow her, clinging to her, refusing to let go. It wasn't just an uncomfortable chill, it was a presence, a coldness that lingered in the air like it was alive. She tried to brush it off. She had to. This was just the house, right? Just the old windows letting in the cold. But the longer she sat there, the colder the room became. It wasn't the kind of cold you could just shrug off. It was too deep, too pervasive. She pulled the blanket tighter, but it didn't help. It felt like the temperature of the room was sinking, and the deeper the cold spread, the more she felt a gnawing sense of dread crawling up her spine. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt it, the presence. Something watching her, waiting. She pulled the blanket tighter, curling into a ball, trying to block out the sensation. But it was always there, lingering just beyond her vision. It was like the air itself was pressing against her, forcing her to acknowledge that she wasn't alone in the room. It wasn't long before Sarah began to see more than just oddities. Over the following nights, she began noticing shadows in the corners of her room. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of the light. Maybe it was just the way the street lamps cast their glow through the curtains, or the way the trees outside moved in the wind. But these shadows, these shapes were different. They weren't just the usual play of light and darkness. They were real and they were moving. Slowly, imperceptibly, like something was creeping just out of sight, waiting for her to notice. One night, she was sitting on the bed trying to focus on her studies when she saw it. It started as a flicker in the corner of her eye, a subtle, impossible to ignore movement. Sarah turned her head slowly, almost cautiously, and there, in the far corner of the room, she saw it. The shadow. It was darker than the rest of the room, blacker than the night outside. It moved, not like a shadow cast by an object, but like a thing of its own. It was as though it had a presence, a weight, something far more than just the absence of light. It wasn't just the trick of the light. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as she watched it shift. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, standing motionless in the corner. She blinked, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Was it a shadow of something in the room? Was it just the odd reflection of the lamp? She strained her eyes, trying to will it away, but it didn't move. It didn't flicker. It just stood there. Her heart began to race. The air grew heavier, denser around her, pressing down on her chest as though it were made of stone. She couldn't look away. The figure in the corner remained, frozen, towering. Her hands clenched at the blanket beneath her, the sensation of cold seeping into her skin once again, as if the figure itself was pulling the warmth from the room. And then, slowly it turned. Not fast, not suddenly, but in a gradual, deliberate motion. Like it was choosing to acknowledge her, to see her. The motion was so unnatural, so wrong, that Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't even scream. The figure's body stretched unnaturally, moving with a slowness that made her stomach churn. It stared at her, though she couldn't make out any features, any detail. Its face was obscured by the shadow itself, a solid, impenetrable darkness that swallowed the light. The figure tilted its head, and in that moment, Sarah felt as though it was studying her. Not just noticing her, but observing her, understanding her in ways she could never comprehend. It wasn't just in the room, it was inside her mind, crawling into the very space where her thoughts were. Her pulse hammered in her chest, but she couldn't move, couldn't scream. She could only watch, her limbs paralyzed, as the figure in the corner finally, slowly turned its head toward her, its presence growing heavier, more oppressive. And then, it did something that made her blood freeze in her veins. Took a step. A single, deliberate step toward her. In that moment, Sarah knew with every fiber of her being, that whatever was standing there wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something far older, far darker, something that had been waiting for her to see it. By this point, Sarah had reached the limits of her patience, and the terror she'd felt had grown into something much more unsettling, an all-consuming dread that tugged at her every waking moment. It had been weeks since she first noticed the strange occurrences, and despite her best efforts to convince herself it was nothing, her fear had slowly transformed into an undeniable truth. Whatever was haunting her house was real. The noises, the cold, the flickering lights, and the inexplicable shadows, they weren't just tricks of the mind. They were something far darker, and it was becoming clear that the house had a life of its own. Something that had been there long before her, and something that wasn't about to leave. She couldn't stand the weight of the house anymore. It felt as though the walls were closing in, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The cold, the unsettling whispers, the feeling of being watched, it was becoming unbearable. She was too afraid to sleep, too afraid to leave. She had nowhere to turn. So, she did the one thing she thought might give her some answers. She reached out to the previous owner. Sarah had heard a few things about the woman who had lived in the house before her. An elderly lady who had lived there for decades before moving away under mysterious circumstances. But she had never thought much of it. She assumed it was just gossip, stories whispered among neighbors, nothing more than idle chatter. Now, however, she needed answers. She needed to know if anyone had ever experienced what she was going through. If anyone had lived through the terror that had become her reality. The old woman's voice was frail, almost as if it hadn't been used in years. It cracked with age, trembling, yet there was something unmistakable in it. A deep, knowing fear, a terror that had been buried but had never fully disappeared. "Hello?" the woman asked, her voice a whisper on the other end of the line. "Who's this?" Her tone wasn't unkind, but there was a sense of caution, as if she already knew what Sarah was going to ask. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I'm Sarah. I recently moved into the house on Elm Street, the one you used to live in. I was wondering if you could tell me if anything strange has ever happened there. I've been hearing things, seeing things, and I don't know who else to turn to." The silence lingered, and Sarah could almost feel the woman's hesitation. It was as if she were weighing the words carefully, deciding whether or not to reveal something she had long kept hidden. The line crackled with a distant tension. Then the woman spoke again, her voice barely audible, almost too quiet to hear. "You're not the first to feel it," the woman whispered, her words soft but laden with an unmistakable weight of experience. "This house, it's cursed. Something dark lingers here. Something that has always been here." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She hadn't expected that. Cursed? The word seemed so heavy, so final. She couldn't believe it, couldn't wrap her mind around the idea of a cursed house. It felt absurd, as though she had stepped into some kind of horror story. "What do you mean, cursed?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. "How could a house be cursed?" The woman's voice grew even more fragile as she spoke, as if the memories of the house were too much to bear. "You'll understand soon enough, child," she said, her voice trembling with a deep, ancient fear. "This house, it feeds on fear. It draws you in, makes you believe you're safe, and then it waits. It waits for you to open up to it, to let your fear take root. And once it has you, it doesn't let go." Sarah's mind was reeling. The woman's words didn't make sense, and yet they rang with such painful clarity. Something in Sarah's gut twisted, an instinctual unease that told her this wasn't just a story. This was real. And something in that house, something hidden deep within the walls, had been feeding on her fear from the moment she stepped inside. "You need to leave," the woman said urgently, her voice breaking. "Please, child, leave before it's too late. You don't understand what you're dealing with. This house, it has a way of changing people. It gets inside your head. It makes you doubt your own mind, and when it does, you'll never be able to escape." Sarah felt a coldness wrap around her as she listened. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and the walls of her room seemed to close in on her. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you leave?" There was another long pause before the woman spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost as though she were afraid someone might be listening. "I had no choice," she said, her words laced with an anguish that Sarah could feel all the way through the phone. "The house, it doesn't let you leave. It changes you, makes you see things, makes you feel things you can't explain. It never stops, never leaves you alone. Some people never leave at all. They just disappear." Sarah's heart was racing now. The fear she had tried so hard to suppress surged back into her chest, overwhelming her. Her mind spun with questions. What did she mean? Who had disappeared? What was happening to her? She wanted to ask more, to demand answers. But the woman's voice faltered again, and Sarah could hear the tremble in her words. "I left, but it never really leaves you, Sarah. Stays with you. It stays with everyone who has ever lived there. Please, you need to leave," the woman begged, her voice now desperate. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Please, before it's too late." Sarah sat there, the phone pressed to her ear, the woman's words still ringing in her mind. "Stays with you." The fear, the dread, the feeling of something watching her. It wasn't just her imagination. It wasn't just a bad dream. The house had claimed her just as it had claimed others before her. And now she was beginning to realize that there was no escape. By the time Sarah decided to confront the terror that had taken over her life, she was no longer the confident, logical person who had moved into the house weeks ago. The house, her home, had become something else entirely. It was no longer a place of comfort or solitude. It was a prison. A place where the walls seemed to close in with every passing moment, where the air itself grew colder with each step she took. And the more she tried to ignore the dark presence she felt every day, the stronger it seemed to grow. Determined to get to the bottom of the horrors that plagued her, Sarah turned to the one thing she could control: information. She had to know what she was dealing with. She had to find out the truth about the house, about its history. No more guessing. No more dismissing it as overactive imagination. She was done living in fear. She needed to know what had happened here, and why the house seemed to want her so badly. Her search led her through town archives, newspaper clippings, and old town records, anything that might give her a hint about what had happened here. Hours passed as she sifted through these documents. Some were mundane, lists of past owners, dates of renovation, and tax records. But others made her skin crawl. There were mentions of the house being built on an old burial ground. Not just any burial ground, but an ancient one, dating back hundreds of years. As Sarah dug deeper, she found something that made her blood run cold. The house wasn't just built on any burial ground, it was built on a site known for unexplained disappearances. Families had vanished without a trace. Entire households, once part of the town, simply disappeared, leaving no evidence of their existence, no clues, no answers. The town records were full of vague mentions, hushed rumors, and half-hearted investigations, but nothing concrete. The disappearances were always left unresolved. The authorities had simply given up on them, chalking them up to strange coincidences. Sarah couldn't believe what she was reading. How had she never known about this? She had lived in the house for weeks now, never once suspecting the dark history that lay beneath it. The more she read, the more the weight of the truth began to sink in. It wasn't just a haunting. No, this was something far worse. The land itself was cursed. It was feeding off the fear of everyone who had ever lived there. And it had only grown stronger with time. The deeper she went into the history, the clearer the pattern became. The disappearances had started long before the house was even built. The land, the burial ground beneath it, had always been a place of death. Ancient rituals, human sacrifices, and bloodshed had stained that land long before it was cleared for construction. There was no way to ignore it now. Sarah could feel it, the darkness that had seeped into the very foundation of the house, the lingering presence that had haunted generations. And now it had her. The more she uncovered, the more her fear turned into something darker, something primal. She realized with chilling clarity that she wasn't just dealing with a spirit or some ancient haunting. No, this thing was something alive. A presence that had existed long before Sarah's arrival, something that had been feeding on the land and on its inhabitants for centuries. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a lingering soul. It was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting for her. And then she found something even more unsettling. A record from the early 1900s, detailing the tragic fate of the family who had lived in the house before it was sold to the woman who had lived there before Sarah. The family had disappeared overnight, just like so many before them. There was no trace of them. No sign of struggle, no remains, no explanation. Just a house left behind, untouched and undisturbed, as if the family had simply vanished into thin air. The only clue left behind was a single note, scrawled hastily on a piece of scrap paper, shoved under the floorboards. The note was short, frantic, barely legible. It read, "It's here. It has us. The house is hungry. Please don't stay. Leave before it gets you." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the note. The words sent a wave of cold fear rushing through her veins. She knew deep down that what had happened to the family before her was the same thing that was happening to her now. The house, this place, had a hunger. It fed on fear, on the terror of its inhabitants, and once it latched on, there was no escape. She sat back, her heart racing, her mind reeling. She could feel the house around her, closing in, breathing in time with her own pulse. She had learned enough, and yet she didn't know if it was enough to save her. The house was more than just a building. It was a living thing. A thing that thrived on fear and torment. It had claimed so many before her, and it was determined to claim her as well. Her mind raced with questions. How could she escape? Was there any way out? Was there anyone else who had survived? But deep down, she knew that escape might not be possible. Not anymore. She had already been marked. The house had already made its claim on her. As the realization sank in, Sarah felt a new, terrifying wave of dread crash over her. The thing in the house, the dark force, wasn't just in the walls. It was in her head. It was everywhere. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. It had already found her. And now it was coming for her. Coming to claim what it had waited for so long to take. On the final night, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. The fear that had been consuming her for weeks, the terror that gripped her every time the house creaked or the shadows seemed to move, had become unbearable. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't keep running from it. She couldn't keep pretending that it was all in her head. There was something in this house, something old and dark, and it was not going to let her go until it had what it wanted. She grabbed the flashlight from her desk, its beam small but enough to pierce the suffocating darkness around her. A prayer escaped her lips, more out of habit than belief, though she wasn't sure anymore if it would offer any protection. The old woman's words echoed in her mind, "It has you. It never lets go." But tonight, Sarah was going to face it. She was going to confront whatever haunted this place. If she didn't, she knew she'd never leave. Not in one piece. Her heart raced as she approached the basement door. It had always been locked, the thought of going down there too terrifying for her to even consider. She had told herself the basement was just like any other room in the house, but deep down she knew it was different. That was where it all began. The house's dark history, the whispers, the strange occurrences, it all seemed to have started from the depths below. And now it was calling her. The temperature dropped as soon as she opened the door, an unnatural coldness sweeping over her. It wasn't the chill of the night air, but something far more unsettling. As Sarah descended the stairs, her breath visible in front of her, the cold seemed to deepen, pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel it. The house wasn't just cold, it was watching her. Waiting. Her heartbeat thudded in her chest, the rhythm erratic, almost frantic. Each step she took, each movement felt like it was pulling her deeper into something she could barely comprehend. The darkness ahead was thick and suffocating. She could barely see a few feet in front of her, the weak beam of the flashlight flickering as if the house itself didn't want her to see what was waiting below. Her hand trembled, gripping the flashlight tighter as she reached the bottom of the stairs. She had to force herself to take a step forward, the air so thick with dread that it felt like something was physically holding her back. Then her eyes fell on something that made her blood freeze in her veins. At the far end of the basement, hidden in the farthest corner, was a door. It wasn't like the others. No handle, no markings, no reason for it to be there. Just a plain wooden door, aged and worn, almost as if it had been forgotten. The wall around it was covered in a thin layer of dust, the floor beneath it cracked and uneven. But it was the door itself that pulled Sarah toward it, an invisible force, an undeniable urge that seemed to come from within the very walls of the house. She moved closer, hesitant, every instinct in her body telling her to turn around, to leave. But she couldn't. She had come this far. She had to know. She had to see what lay beyond it. With trembling hands, she gripped the door frame, the cool wood against her fingers as she pushed the door open. What she found beyond the door was nothing like she had imagined. The room was small, barely big enough for her to stand in. The air in the room was thick, almost choking. And the walls were covered in symbols. Strange, intricate markings etched into the stone, worn with age, faded but still clearly visible. Sarah's eyes scanned the walls, her stomach sinking as she recognized them, runes. Ancient symbols, ones she had seen before in the old town records, in the forgotten books of the house's history. They were the same symbols the early settlers had used, the ones associated with forbidden rituals, dark sacrifices, and the worship of something other. She stepped into the room, her heart pounding as the flashlight flickered once again. The walls were covered in the markings, but there was more. At the center of the room, on the floor, was a large circle. It looked like a ritual circle, one that had been drawn in what seemed like old, dark ink. In the center of the circle was something that made Sarah's breath catch, an offering bowl. It was empty, but the faint scent of decay lingered in the air. Something had been placed there. Something had been sacrificed. The room was suffocating, each breath more difficult than the last. It felt as though the very air in the room was alive, pressing down on her from every direction. She could feel it, the presence that had been in the house all along. It was here in this room, in these markings. The thing that had been waiting, watching for so long. Sarah could hear it now. The whispers, the sound of something moving in the dark, skittering just out of reach. She turned, her heart racing, her eyes scanning the shadows, but she couldn't see anything. The whispers grew louder, filling her ears, until it felt like the room itself was speaking to her. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe with her, and the ground beneath her feet shifted, like something was moving beneath the floorboards. She took a step back, her pulse hammering in her ears. But the room wasn't empty. There, in the farthest corner, she saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, standing perfectly still. It wasn't a figure, not exactly. It was an outline, a mass of shifting, swirling darkness, a thing that didn't belong, a thing that had never belonged. The shadow stretched toward her, moving with slow, deliberate intent. Sarah's flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into total darkness. In the pitch-black silence, she heard it, a whisper so close to her ear it sent a jolt of terror through her body. As Sarah stood frozen, the whispers around her grew louder. She could no longer distinguish where they came from. Every corner, every shadow, seemed to hum with a presence that was now unmistakable. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and it wasn't just a cold, it was a biting chill that seemed to cut into her very skin, as though the air had thickened, pressing against her chest. Each breath became more labored, as if she were inhaling ice itself. Her heartbeat rang in her ears, faster, more erratic, as if her body could sense something she couldn't yet see. The oppressive silence around her grew louder, drowning out all thought, all reasoning. Her flashlight flickered once more, then died completely, leaving her alone in the thickening dark. The faint light from the basement sole window didn't help, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the room, creating an effect that made the walls feel alive. But in the middle of the blackness, something shifted. Sarah tried to move, but her legs were like lead, her body paralyzed. She could feel the floor beneath her feet vibrate slightly, a subtle shift in the air, a presence growing stronger, more powerful. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, it happened. The figure appeared in front of her. At first, it was just a shape, something barely discernible in the overwhelming darkness. But then, it became clearer, taller than a man, wider, its form solidifying as though it were pulling itself from the very shadows, a thing of pure blackness that seemed to devour the light. But it wasn't just a mass of darkness. No, it was alive, a presence made of shadow, yet unmistakably human in shape. Its features were blurred, distorted by the dark that surrounded it, but the eyes, those eyes, they glowed. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the glow of the eyes pierced through the darkness. They weren't ordinary eyes. No, these eyes were unnatural, like lanterns, cold and unfeeling, casting an unnatural light in the pitch-black room. The glow seemed to burn through the shadows, piercing the space between her and the figure, pulling her closer as though it was drawing her in with its gaze. In that instant, Sarah could feel its presence like a weight, pressing down on her, suffocating her with every passing second. The room felt smaller now, the air thinner. She could feel it in her bones, in the very marrow of her soul. The entity was inside her. It wasn't just in the room, it wasn't just in the walls or the shadows. No, it was inside her, clawing at her thoughts, at her mind. The fear she had been trying to hold back for weeks was now overwhelming, seeping out of her like a flood she could no longer control. It took a step toward her. No, not a step, an elongation. It stretched as if the darkness itself was bending, twisting toward her. Its form was no longer a solid mass. It rippled, distorting in impossible ways as though it was made of smoke and shadow, but its eyes remained fixed on her, never leaving. The room felt smaller, the walls creeping in as though the very space around her was shrinking, squeezing her, suffocating her. Sarah's body trembled uncontrollably, her legs giving way beneath her. She fell to the floor, her flashlight lying useless beside her, its beam now completely blacked out. But she couldn't take her eyes off the figure. As it moved closer, the air around her grew colder, colder than the basement had ever been. It felt like she was freezing from the inside out, as though the very life force within her was being drained away. It reached out toward her. Its arm, long and impossibly thin, stretched toward her with a fluid motion that didn't seem right, as though it was both solid and not solid at all. Its fingers, long, bony, and unnaturally stretched, moved toward her face. It was coming for her. She could feel it, the coldness in its touch, the weight of its presence as it reached for her, a silent promise that once it touched her, she would be no more. In that moment, Sarah knew. She knew that she was no longer alone in the house. She had never been alone. The entity had always been there, lurking in the corners of her vision, hiding in the spaces between thoughts, waiting for her to acknowledge it. She had walked into its trap, step by step, ever since the first night it found her. The house had been waiting for her. She had been its next victim all along. Before she could scream, before she could fight back, the figure's fingers were upon her. The cold, oppressive touch seeped through her skin, crawling into her veins. It felt like ice had invaded her very body, freezing her from the inside out. She tried to pull away, to scream, to call for help, but no sound came. Her body was paralyzed, her limbs unresponsive to her frantic will. The more she tried to move, the more her body refused her, as if it were being drained of its energy, its warmth, its life. Her vision blurred. The edges of the room, the shadows, seemed to warp and twist around her. The walls were no longer solid. The house itself seemed to come alive, bending, shifting like it was growing, reaching for her, pulling her deeper into its hold. The light from the flashlight, still lying on the floor, flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows that danced and shifted along the walls, creating monstrous shapes in the corners of her vision. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure pulled back. It didn't vanish, but it stepped away, its form shifting, becoming less solid, fading into the darkness like smoke being blown away by an unseen wind. Sarah's breath was ragged, her chest heaving in the freezing cold air. Her eyes darted around the room, her heart still pounding, the terror still thick in her chest. She felt like she was in the grip of a nightmare that wouldn't end. With one final chilling whisper, it spoke. "You should have never stayed." Sarah had never imagined she would come to this. But there she was, trembling, standing on the edge of everything she had ever known, everything she had ever trusted, watching the house loom behind her like some monstrous shadow. The hours spent trapped in that place, feeling its oppressive weight, had pushed her to the breaking point. And in a split second, as the figure in the darkness reached for her, the only thing she could think of was escape. Her feet pounded against the floor, each step more desperate than the last. The door to the basement slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. She didn't stop. She didn't think. She just ran. Her mind was a blur of panic, a rush of instinct that carried her forward into the night. She couldn't look back. She couldn't stop. The fear, raw and primal, surged through her veins like ice. The house, the presence, it was all behind her now, but she knew deep down that the nightmare was far from over. And yet all she could do was run and not look back. The wind bit at her skin as she sprinted down the front steps, her body trembling from the cold and from the sheer terror of what had just happened. She didn't look over her shoulder. She couldn't. The darkness behind her felt like it had reached out, trying to drag her back, but she pushed forward, her legs burning with effort, her lungs aching as she ran as fast as her feet would carry her. She kept running through the yard, past the trees, until the house was nothing more than a distant shadow behind her. The moonlit sky above her seemed so vast, so empty, yet somehow comforting. The stillness of the night was broken only by her frantic footsteps, the harshness of her breath. It was only then, when the house was far behind, that she finally slowed to a stop, her body trembling in the cold air. She bent over, hands on her knees, gasping for breath. She had escaped. But in that moment, the weight of what had happened came crashing down on her. Sarah didn't stop running until she found a friend's house, her body aching, her mind spinning with the images of what she had just left behind. The house, the shadows, the terrible figure, it was all so fresh in her mind. It had only been hours, but it felt like a lifetime. She explained what happened in quick, panicked sentences, her words tumbling over each other, but her friend didn't believe her. Who would? How could anyone? Sarah herself could barely believe it had all been real. But deep down she knew. She knew she hadn't imagined any of it. The house had been alive, breathing, moving around her, feeding on her fear. And now, it seemed as though the terror would follow her forever. That night she stayed with her friend. She tried to sleep, but every creak in the house, every wind gust that tapped against the windows, sent her heart racing. She lay wide awake, eyes darting to every corner of the room, feeling the heavy weight of the dark pull at her thoughts. Sleep, however, didn't come. It never did. How could it? The house, that house, was still inside her head, and no amount of distance, no change in scenery could erase it from her mind. When morning came, the sun hung in the sky like a distant, indifferent observer. Sarah tried to convince herself that everything would be normal. The terror she had felt would fade. She would go back, gather her things, and put the nightmare behind her. But she knew that it wasn't that simple. It couldn't be. Not after what had happened. She returned to the house the next morning, her body aching from the night of restless sleep, her mind still running in circles. She knew she couldn't leave everything behind. She had to gather her things, get out for good. She walked slowly up the front steps, her legs heavy, her mind clouded with uncertainty. The house loomed in front of her, but this time there was no fear, no rush of adrenaline, just confusion. A strange, unsettling feeling that crept up her spine as she reached for the door. The door opened easily, too easily. It didn't resist like it should have. It wasn't warped, it wasn't locked. It simply opened like the house was welcoming her back, as though nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Everything had changed. Inside, the house looked different. At first, Sarah didn't realize what was wrong. She wandered from room to room, her eyes scanning the familiar spaces. Her living room, the kitchen, the hallway, but nothing seemed out of place. Everything was perfect. The floorboards that had been cracked and weathered were now smooth, the paint on the walls fresh and flawless. The dust that had once gathered on the furniture was gone, as if the house had been meticulously cleaned. The walls, once damp and cracked, were now pristine like they had never aged. Everything was immaculate, and it was wrong. It felt wrong. It looked wrong. How could it be? Just hours ago, this house had been decaying, falling apart, suffocating with darkness. And now, it was as if the house had repaired itself overnight. It was too perfect, too pristine. As if everything had been erased. The terror, the shadows, the haunting presence that had once filled every corner. She stepped through the house in a daze, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. She reached the kitchen and stopped dead in her tracks. The window was perfectly clean. No cobwebs, no dust. The counter was immaculate, with nothing out of place. The creaky, broken appliances that used to fill the space were now pristine, shining under the artificial light. Sarah turned slowly, her body trembling with an odd mix of confusion and dread. The house was perfect, but it felt wrong. It felt like a facade, as though the house was pretending to be something it wasn't, something it would never be again. And then her gaze fell upon the mirror in the hallway. At first, it was a simple reflection, a reflection of herself standing there bewildered. But then, just as she turned away, she saw it. In the mirror, standing behind her, was the shadow. The same shadow that had followed her from the beginning. It was just a figure, but it was there, in the reflection, standing perfectly still, just like it had before. But when she turned around, there was nothing. The hallway was empty, just as it had been moments before. Her heart raced, pounding in her chest as she rushed from room to room. Everything was still perfect, but it wasn't real. It couldn't be. This wasn't the house she had left behind. This wasn't the house that had terrified her for weeks. But the feeling, the oppressive weight, was still there. Something was still in this house, something that was never going to let her go. It was watching her, waiting for her to slip, to fall back into its grasp. She didn't stay long after that. She couldn't. The house was no longer the decaying, oppressive place it had once been, but it wasn't safe. It was something else now, something worse. And Sarah knew deep in her gut that the house wasn't finished with her. It was waiting. And someday it would call her back. As Sarah moved to leave for good, her heart still heavy with fear, she forced herself to take one last look at the house. The front door, now swinging closed behind her, creaked eerily in the wind. She had fought so hard to leave, to escape the suffocating grip the house had on her, but as she stood on the driveway, something inside her compelled her to glance back. Maybe it was the quiet tug in her chest, the last shred of attachment to a place that had once been home, or maybe it was the lingering sense of unfinished business. She wasn't sure. But she turned, her body stiff, her legs still trembling from the weight of everything she had just endured. For just a moment she thought she saw it. At first, it was a movement in the window, a shadow that crossed from one side to the other, quick and deliberate. Then, in an instant, it stopped. The figure was there, standing in the window, watching her. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dimming light of the day, the same eerie light she had seen on the night she first encountered it. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure in the window wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't the distorted reflection of her imagination. No, this time it was unmistakable. The same figure that had tormented her for weeks. The same shadow that had haunted every corner of the house, that had stood so still and yet so menacing, was watching her now. She could see the outline of it clearly, tall, thin, its features indistinguishable but its presence so heavy, so real. Her heart slammed against her rib cage, the thud in her chest threatening to drown out everything around her. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet were glued to the ground, her body frozen in place. In the window, the figure tilted its head slightly, just as it had done in the basement, its gaze never leaving her. And then, as if it had seen enough, it stepped back, disappearing behind the thick curtains that had once hidden its presence from her. For a long moment, Sarah stood there, staring at the window, hoping, praying, that the figure wouldn't return. That maybe this time it was over. But deep down she knew it wasn't. The terror that had gripped her soul for so long, the constant fear that had bled into every thought, every moment, wasn't gone. It wasn't finished. It never would be. The figure may have stepped away from the window, but the house wasn't finished. It wasn't done with her. And in that brief, heart-stopping moment, Sarah realized that the house, the very land it was built on, had claimed her long ago. It had never truly let go. The nightmares had been just the beginning. The terror had followed her, reaching into her every waking moment, into every thought. And the figure, the thing that had haunted her for so long, wasn't just an apparition. It wasn't just a ghost, a spirit, or a shadow. It was something far older, something that lived in the house, in the land, in the very walls themselves. As Sarah turned away from the house and walked toward her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there. Watching. Waiting. She climbed into her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't look back. Not again. She couldn't. But she could feel it. The presence. It was still there in the back of her mind. She could still hear the whispers, still feel the eyes of the figure upon her, even as the house shrank behind her in the rearview mirror. As she drove away, a new, terrifying realization settled in her chest. The house was never truly just a house. It was a place of dark power, a place that fed on the fear of those who came too close, a place that stretched across time, across space. And though Sarah was no longer physically inside it, it was still with her, etched into her memory, into her very soul. The house had taken something from her. Something she couldn't escape. Not from the shadows, not from the whispers, not from the ever-present feeling of being watched. She didn't go back. She couldn't. But as the car sped away, the terror didn't leave. It followed her, a shadow in the rearview mirror, waiting. The house had been cursed, yes, but it was more than just a curse. It was alive. And Sarah knew deep down that it was always alive, always waiting for someone to come close enough. Someone like her. No one knows exactly what happened to Sarah after that night. She vanished from the small town, no longer a presence in the lives of those who had known her. Her friends and family say she moved far away, started a new life somewhere far from the shadows of that house. Some say she found peace, that the terror she had experienced was nothing more than a distant memory she could eventually put behind her. But those who lived close by, those who had seen the toll that house had taken on her, those people weren't so sure. Some believe she never truly escaped. Some say she was never able to leave the grip of that cursed place, no matter how far she ran. And for those who dared to stay in the town, the rumors began to spread again. The same rumors that had plagued the house for generations. Stories of people vanishing without a trace, of strange happenings in the dead of night. Whispers of footsteps echoing in empty hallways, cold spots that appeared in the strangest places, and voices that seemed to call from beyond the grave. Some nights, when the moon hangs low in the sky and the streets are bathed in an eerie stillness, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Moving through the empty halls of that house, echoing out into the night. Some say they're just the sounds of an old house settling, the wind playing tricks on the mind. But others, those who know the true story, swear that it's something more, that the footsteps are not just the house but something else, something dark and restless, still waiting for its next victim. Occasionally, someone brave or foolish will pass by the house late at night. The house that still stands there, seemingly untouched by time, pristine and perfect as though nothing ever happened. They say the air around it is heavy, oppressive, like the house is holding its breath. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough, if you listen with a sharp ear, you can hear the footsteps coming from inside, slowly, as though someone or something is walking through rooms long abandoned. And then there's the story of the light in the attic. At night, when the town is sleeping, sometimes people claim they see it, just for a brief moment, a faint flicker of light shining from the attic window. It's the same light that used to glow from that window when Sarah was still there, the same light that had cast long, haunting shadows across the walls. Some believe it's a reflection, an optical illusion, but others believe it's her, or something pretending to be her. Sarah's name is still whispered in the town, though no one dares to speak it too loudly. The memory of her, the horror she endured, and the terror that still clings to that house, lingers in the air, a fog that won't lift. Some say she's gone for good, that the house has released its hold on her. But the truth is far more unsettling. The truth is that once you step into that house, once you become a part of its story, it never really lets you go. Every now and then, someone visiting the town will ask about the house. They'll inquire about its history, about the strange rumors surrounding it. And some will laugh it off, dismissing the stories as mere superstition, as nonsense. But others, the ones who have lived there long enough, will lower their voices and say, it's not just the house, something more. And once it has you, it never really lets go. So, Sarah's story remains a mystery, a warning passed down in whispers, a tale of terror that stretches across time, haunting the town, haunting the land, haunting everyone who dares to listen too closely. The footsteps still echo in the quiet of the night. And the house, it waits, watching, waiting, because it knows that no one, no matter how far they run, can ever truly escape. You've heard Sarah's terrifying story, but is it truly over? Could there be more to the curse of that house? Or did Sarah's fear somehow awaken something even darker? Something that's still out there waiting? The footsteps, the whispers, the figure in the window, they all point to one thing. The house isn't done with its victims. Not yet. And maybe it never will be. If you want to hear more terrifying true stories that will keep you up at night, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with your friends. You wouldn't want them to miss out on the chilling mysteries that lurk just beneath the surface, would you? Leave a comment below with your thoughts or theories. Do you believe Sarah ever truly escaped the curse of that house? Or did she just awaken something worse? Have you ever had an experience like hers? Maybe a house that haunted you long after you left? We'd love to hear your stories. Share them with us. And remember, you never know what's hiding in the shadows. It could be waiting for you just like it waited for Sarah.